What if an ancient city was whispered to perform human sacrifice every single night under the glow of burning altars? Across centuries, chilling stories have survived about a mysterious ritual practiced in the shadows of ancient civilizations, where fire, devotion, and terror intertwined. This documentary explores those accounts, recorded by ancient historians, debated by modern scholars, and surrounded by controversy. Were these sacrifices real, exaggerated, or propaganda? Stay with this story, and if dark history fascinates you, like, subscribe, and uncover the terrifying intersection between myth, fear, and power that shaped how entire civilizations were remembered. In ancient Mediterranean history, one of the most feared accusations was ritual child sacrifice. Greek and Roman writers described distant civilizations practicing horrifying ceremonies dedicated to deities associated with fire and destruction. These accounts often centered on the city of Carthage, where sacred sites known as tophets contained urns with remains. Scholars today debate whether these remains confirm sacrifice or represent funerary customs. However, in ancient narratives, these places became symbols of terror. The idea of nightly offerings emerged not as verified fact, but as a powerful accusation shaping political and cultural hostility. The ritual described in hostile sources involved large bronze statues, often depicted as hollow figures associated with deities like Baal, Hammon, or similar figures. According to later Roman interpretations, children were placed into the arms of these statues, which were then heated by fire beneath. The descriptions, however, come primarily from opponents of Carthage, especially during periods of war. These accounts may reflect propaganda designed to portray enemies as barbaric. Still, the imagery became deeply embedded in historical imagination, influencing centuries of storytelling about ancient cruelty and ritualized violence. Archaeological discoveries at Carthage's Tophet sites revealed urns containing cremated remains of infants and animals. Some researchers argue these were sacrificial offerings, while others suggest they were burial grounds for children who died naturally. The ambiguity fuels ongoing debate. Ancient writers like Plutarch and Diodorus Siculus described ritual killings in dramatic terms, but their accounts were written long after the events and often lacked direct evidence. The tension between archaeology and literature creates a complex picture, where fact and fear merge into a narrative that is difficult to separate cleanly. The idea of nightly sacrifice appears more in symbolic interpretation than in direct historical record. Ancient authors often exaggerated enemy practices to emphasize moral superiority. In wartime propaganda, depicting an opponent as engaging in repeated ritual killings served political purposes. It justified conquest and reinforced cultural identity. The notion of daily or nightly repetition intensified the horror, making the imagined ritual seem systematic and unstoppable. Whether or not such frequency existed, the belief itself became more influential than the reality, shaping how entire civilizations were judged by later empires. In these accounts, priests played central roles, described as figures dressed in ceremonial robes, conducting rituals under torchlight. Drums and chants were said to drown out cries, according to hostile narratives. However, these descriptions vary widely depending on the source. Some historians argue that such details reflect Greek theatrical imagination rather than eyewitness testimony. The ritual space itself, often described as an open-air sanctuary, was portrayed as both sacred and terrifying. The combination of fire, silence, and darkness created a powerful image that endured far beyond the fall of the civilization accused. The emotional weight of these stories lies in their psychological impact. Ancient writers understood that describing the sacrifice of children created maximum moral shock. Even if exaggerated, these narratives shaped how later civilizations understood the concept of barbarism. The accused society became a symbol of moral extremity, regardless of archaeological uncertainty. This demonstrates how history is often constructed not only from evidence, but also from perception, fear, and narrative power. The ritual, whether real or imagined, became a tool for defining cultural boundaries between civilized and uncivilized worlds. Some interpretations suggest that fire played a symbolic role rather than purely destructive one. Fire represented purification, transformation, and communication with divine forces in many ancient religions. Within hostile accounts, however, this symbolism was reinterpreted as cruelty. The transformation of religious meaning into horror illustrates how cultural misunderstanding can reshape history. Ritual practices that may have had metaphorical or ceremonial significance were reframed as literal acts of violence. This shift in interpretation highlights the importance of examining multiple perspectives when reconstructing ancient belief systems. Roman historians, particularly during and after the Punic Wars, had strong political motivations to portray Carthage negatively. By emphasizing alleged human sacrifice, they strengthened Rome's moral justification for destruction and conquest. The portrayal of nightly rituals amplified this narrative, suggesting an ongoing, organized system of horror. These descriptions helped dehumanize the enemy, making military action appear not only necessary but righteous. As a result, historical memory was shaped as much by political victory as by factual accuracy, leaving a legacy clouded by propaganda and fear-driven storytelling. Modern archaeology has introduced more nuance to this story. Excavations reveal patterns that do not always align with ancient written accounts. While evidence of infant remains exists, interpretation varies significantly among scholars. Some propose that high infant mortality rates in antiquity could explain burial practices without invoking sacrifice. Others maintain that ritual elements cannot be entirely dismissed. The absence of definitive proof keeps the debate open. What remains clear is that ancient societies had complex relationships with death, religion, and commemoration, far more intricate than simplified historical accusations suggest. The persistence of the sacrifice narrative into modern culture demonstrates the power of ancient storytelling. Literature, art, and film have often repeated the idea of nightly ritual sacrifice, reinforcing its place in popular imagination. Even without conclusive evidence, the story survives because it embodies deep human fears about ritual, authority, and violence. It reflects anxieties about what civilizations might do behind closed doors. This emotional resonance ensures that the narrative continues to be retold, regardless of historical certainty, blending myth and memory into a lasting cultural image. Psychologically, the concept of repeated nightly sacrifice creates a sense of endless horror. Unlike isolated acts of violence, repetition suggests system, order, and inevitability. This makes the story more disturbing and memorable. Ancient writers may have understood this effect, using it to maximize emotional impact. Whether describing enemies or warning their own societies, such imagery functioned as moral commentary. It reminds modern audiences that historical narratives are often shaped not just to inform, but to provoke emotional and ethical responses. In examining these accounts, historians emphasize the importance of separating evidence from interpretation. Ancient texts must be read critically, considering bias, context, and purpose. Archaeological findings must also be carefully interpreted without assumptions shaped by later narratives. The ritual of human sacrifice, especially in its nightly form, remains unproven as historical fact. However, its role in shaping historical perception is undeniable. It stands as an example of how powerful stories can define civilizations long after their disappearance, influencing identity and memory across millennia. The story of the alleged nightly sacrifice ritual is ultimately a reflection of how fear shapes history. Whether rooted in misunderstood practices or constructed as propaganda, it reveals how easily narratives of horror can define entire cultures. It challenges us to question what we accept as historical truth and what may be inherited fear. History is not only about what happened, but also about how it is remembered. If this story made you reflect on truth, perception, and power, then its purpose is fulfilled. Dark history is filled with stories that blur the line between myth and reality, truth and interpretation. The ritual that was said to occur every night remains one of the most controversial and debated narratives of the ancient world. If you want more deep dives into history's darkest mysteries, subscribe, like, and continue exploring with us. Because the past is never just what happened, it is also what people believed happened, and that belief can be just as powerful as history itself.